Jake Morrison sat by his campfire and watched the flames dance in the cold Montana night. The wood cracked and popped as orange light pushed back the darkness around his small camp. He had been out here for 3 days now, 20 miles from the nearest road and 40 miles from the nearest town. This was exactly how he liked it. The 34-year-old man took a sip from his metal cup and tasted the strong coffee he had made over the fire. No instant coffee for Jake. He ground the beans himself and boiled the water in an old military pot. Everything he did the hard way, the right way. Jake pulled his wool blanket tighter around his shoulders. October in Montana could be brutal, but he had prepared for it. His shelter was a simple lean-to made from branches and his tarp. His sleeping bag was rated for temperatures well below freezing. His food would last him another week if he needed it to. But Jake could make it last longer if he had to. He knew how to trap rabbits and catch fish. He knew which plants were safe to eat and which ones would kill you. Most people thought Jake was crazy for living this way. His cabin had no electricity and no running water. He used solar panels and a hand pump well. He grew his own food and hunted his own meat. When people asked him why, he would just smile and say he liked being ready for anything. Jake had learned to be ready during his time in the Marines. 6 years of service had taught him that the world was not a safe place. Bad things happened when you least expected them. The smart man was the one who prepared for those bad things before they came. After leaving the military, Jake had worked as a survival instructor. He taught rich city people how to start fires without matches and find water in the desert. Most of them thought it was fun, like a game. Jake knew it was life and death. The skills he taught could mean the difference between going home to your family and dying alone in the wilderness. 3 years ago, Jake had saved enough money to buy his cabin and the land around it. 50 acres of forest and mountains where no one would bother him. He quit his teaching job and moved out here full-time. Now he only went to town once a month for supplies he could not make or grow himself. The fire was getting low, so Jake added another piece of wood. The flames jumped higher and threw more heat toward him. In the distance, an owl called out across the forest. Jake smiled. This was peace. This was freedom. No bills to pay, no boss to answer to, no neighbors to deal with. Just him in the wilderness. Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his tactical knife. The black blade was 6 inches long and sharp enough to shave with. He had carried this knife for 8 years, through his last tour in Afghanistan and every camping trip since. The handle was worn smooth from use, but the blade was still perfect. Jake took care of his tools because his tools took care of him. He also pulled out a small ferro rod, about the size of a pencil. This little tool could start thousands of fires. Jake struck it with the back of his knife and sent a shower of sparks into the fire. He did not need to do this, but he liked to practice. Skills got rusty if you did not use them. A cool wind blew through the trees and made the fire flicker. Jake looked up at the stars. Out here, away from all the city lights, you could see everything. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. Jake had always loved looking at the stars. As a kid, he used to wonder if there was life out there somewhere. The wind died down, and the forest became quiet again. Too quiet. Jake noticed it right away. The owl had stopped calling. The insects had stopped buzzing. Even the small animals, moving through the brush, had gone silent. In his experience, that meant something was wrong. Jake slowly stood up and moved away from the fire. The flames made him an easy target and hurt his night vision. He stepped into the shadows between the trees and listened. His hand moved to the knife on his belt. That was when he saw the light. It started as a faint blue glow above the trees. At first, Jake thought it might be the northern lights, but the glow got brighter and started moving. It was coming down toward his camp. Jake moved deeper into the trees. Whatever this was, he wanted to see it before it saw him. The light got brighter and brighter until it hurt to look at. The glow lit up the entire forest like daylight. Something was coming down through the trees. Jake could not see what it was because of the bright light, but he could hear it. A low humming sound, like electricity running through power lines. The sound got louder as the thing got closer to the ground. The light stopped moving and hung in the air about 20 feet above Jake's campfire. The humming sound got quieter but did not stop. Jake crouched behind a large pine tree and watched. Shapes began moving in the light. They were tall and thin, much taller than any person Jake had ever seen. They moved in a strange way, like they were floating instead of walking. Jake counted at least 4 of them, maybe more. The shapes began to come down from the light. As they got closer to the ground, Jake could see them more clearly. They were not human. Their bodies were thin and stretched out, like someone had taken a person and pulled them taller. Their heads were too big for their bodies, and their arms and legs were too long. Jake had seen a lot of strange things in his life, but nothing like this. His heart was beating fast, but his mind was clear. Whatever these things were, they were not friendly. They had not made any attempt to communicate or announce themselves. They were just taking what they wanted. 2 of the creatures moved toward his campfire. They seemed to be studying it, pointing at the flames and making sounds Jake could not understand. Their voices were high and musical, not like human voices at all. Jake knew he had to move. He could not stay hidden forever, and he did not want to be trapped in one place. He started to back away from the tree, moving as quietly as he could. That was when one of the creatures turned and looked right at him. The thing had large black eyes that took up most of its face. It stared at Jake for a moment, then made a sound to the others. All of them turned to look at him. Jake ran. He crashed through the brush and between the trees, using every bit of cover he could find. Behind him, he could hear the creatures following. They were fast, much faster than they looked. The humming sound got louder, and the blue light began to chase him through the forest. Jake made it about 100 yards before something hit him. It felt like electricity running through his whole body. His muscles stopped working, and he fell to the ground. He tried to get up, but his body would not listen to him. The creatures surrounded him. Up close, they were even stranger looking. Their skin was gray and seemed to glow slightly in the dark. They wore clothes that looked like they were made of metal, but moved like fabric. One of them knelt down next to Jake and touched his forehead. Jake tried to pull away, but he still could not move. The creature's touch was cold and made his head feel funny. The world started to get dark around the edges. Jake fought to stay conscious, but whatever they had done to him was too strong. As everything went black, he managed to slip his tactical knife and ferro rod into his pants pocket. The creatures did not notice. To them, these simple tools were probably just worthless junk. Jake's last thought before he passed out was that he should have listened to his instincts. The quiet forest had been trying to warn him. Something bad was coming, and now it was here. Jake woke up in a box made of clear walls. His head hurt, and his mouth tasted like metal. He sat up slowly and looked around. The box was about 10 feet square and 8 feet tall. The walls looked like glass but felt warm when he touched them. Outside, His prison, Jake could see a large room with curved walls and ceiling. Everything was white and clean like a hospital. Strange lights hung in the air without any visible support. The floor had patterns that seemed to move when he was not looking directly at them. Jake stood up and tested his body. His muscles were sore, but they worked. Whatever the creatures had done to him was wearing off. He reached into his pocket and was relieved to find his knife and ferro rod still there. The creatures had not searched him properly. A door opened in the far wall, and 3 of the creatures entered the room. They were even stranger looking in the bright light. Their gray skin was smooth like rubber, and their large black eyes never seemed to blink. They wore the same metal clothes that moved like fabric. The tallest creature approached Jake's prison. When it spoke, the words came from a small device on its chest, not from its mouth. "Human specimen is awake," the device said in a flat, emotionless voice. "Beginning communication protocol." Jake did not respond. In the Marines, he had been trained to give only name, rank, and serial number if captured. This situation was different, but the same rules applied. "Say nothing useful. I am Commander Vex of the research vessel Inquiry," the device continued. "You have been selected for our study of human survival capabilities. Do not be afraid. You will not be permanently harmed." Jake almost laughed. These creatures had kidnapped him and put him in a cage, and they expected him not to be afraid. He crossed his arms and stared at Commander Vex without saying anything. "Your species shows promise," Vex continued. "We have been observing your planet for many cycles. Humans adapt well to different environments. This makes you interesting subjects for our research." The other 2 creatures were looking at devices that showed images of Jake's body. They seemed to be taking measurements and making notes. Jake noticed they moved carefully, like they were not used to physical activity. "You will be placed in controlled environments," Vex explained. "We will observe how you respond to different challenges. Your survival skills will be tested under various conditions. The data will help us understand your species better." Jake finally spoke. "What do you want with Earth?" Commander Vex tilted his large head to one side. "Earth is a suitable world for colonization. Your species will be relocated to areas that do not interfere with our needs." The words hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. These creatures were not just studying humans. They were planning to take Earth. They thought humans were just another animal species to be managed and controlled. "Relocation to where?" Jake asked. "That has not been determined," Vex replied. "First, we must understand your capabilities and limitations. Some humans may be useful as workers. Others will be unnecessary." Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his face blank. Getting emotional would not help him. He needed to think and plan. These creatures saw humans as inferior, which meant they would underestimate him. That could be useful. "The first test will begin soon," Vex announced. "You will be placed in a survival scenario. We expect you to fail within 1 standard day. Most humans break quickly when removed from their artificial environments." The 3 creatures left the room. Jake was alone again, but he knew they were watching him. He could feel eyes on him, even though he could not see any cameras. He walked around his prison, examining every surface and joint. The walls were not actually glass. They felt more like some kind of energy field made solid. There were no visible seams or weak points. The floor of his prison was different from the floor outside. It felt softer, almost alive. Jake sat down in the center of his prison and closed his eyes. He needed to think about what he had learned. The creatures called themselves researchers, but they were really invaders. They had been watching Earth for a long time, which meant they knew human technology and capabilities. But they did not seem to understand human nature. Commander Vex had said they expected him to fail within 1 day. That told Jake these creatures had never dealt with someone who actually knew how to survive. They probably captured city people who panicked when their cell phones stopped working. Jake opened his eyes and looked around the room again. Everything was too clean, too perfect. These creatures lived in an artificial environment where everything was controlled. They probably had not faced real challenges in thousands of years. That made them smart, but soft. The door opened again, and different creatures entered. These ones were smaller and moved differently. They carried strange tools that hummed with energy. Jake recognized them as guards, even though they did not look like any guards he had ever seen. One of the guards pointed a device at Jake's prison. The clear walls began to fade away. Jake tensed, ready to fight or run, but the guards stayed back. They were being careful. "Human will move to transport chamber," one of them said through its chest device. "Resistance will result in unconsciousness." Jake looked at the guards and their weapons. He could probably take 1 or 2 of them, but there were 6 guards and they had energy weapons. This was not the time to fight. He needed to see where they were taking him and learn more about their ship. Jake walked slowly toward the guards. They formed a circle around him but stayed several feet away. They moved him through corridors that curved and twisted in ways that made no sense. The walls were covered in symbols that might have been writing or decorations. They passed other rooms with transparent walls. Inside some rooms, Jake saw creatures working with devices he did not recognize. Other rooms contained things that might have been plants, but they moved without any wind. Everything was alien and strange. The guards led Jake to a smaller room, with no windows. In the center was a platform surrounded by pillars that glowed with blue light. One of the guards gestured for Jake to step onto the platform. Jake hesitated. He had no idea what this device was supposed to do. For all he knew, it might kill him. But he had to take the risk. He needed to see what these creatures had planned for him. He stepped onto the platform. Immediately, the blue light got brighter, and Jake felt a tingling sensation all over his body. The room around him began to fade away, like he was dissolving. But he could still think and feel. The tingling stopped, and Jake found himself standing in a completely different place. Instead of the clean white walls of the ship, he was surrounded by rocks and sand. The air was hot and dry. Above him, he could see 2 suns in a purple sky. Jake looked around and took in his surroundings. He was in a desert, but not like any desert on Earth. The sand was red and the rocks were twisted into strange shapes. In the distance, he could see mountains that looked like broken glass. This was the survival test Commander Vex had talked about. The creatures had somehow moved him to this place, or created an artificial environment that felt completely real. Either way, Jake was now in a hostile desert with no supplies and no shelter. He smiled. This was going to be interesting. Jake began walking in a slow circle, studying the terrain. The sand under his feet was soft and shifted with each step. The rocks were sharp and would cut anyone who was not careful. The heat was intense, but Jake had trained in deserts before. He knew how to handle it. He found a patch of shade behind a large rock and sat down. The first rule of desert survival was to avoid moving during the hottest part of the day. Let his captors think he was already giving up. Meanwhile, he would plan his next move. Jake reached into his pocket and felt his knife and ferro rod. The creatures had let him keep these tools because they thought they were harmless. They were about to learn how wrong they were. He looked up at the purple sky and wondered if this was a real place or some kind of simulation. It did not matter. Real or artificial, he would treat it as real. He would survive. And then he would escape. The creatures expected him to break within one day. Jake intended to prove them very wrong. Jake spent the first hour in the shade, watching and learning. The desert around him was more complex than it first appeared. Small creatures moved between the rocks, and plants grew in the cracks where moisture collected. This was not a dead wasteland. It was a living ecosystem, and that meant he could survive here. He noticed patterns in the way the shadows moved. The two suns followed different paths across the purple sky, which meant this place had unusual day and night cycles. Jake would need to figure out the timing if he wanted to move efficiently. When the larger sun moved behind a cloud, Jake left his shelter and began exploring. He walked carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The red sand was loose in some places and hard-packed in others. Hidden rocks could twist an ankle or cause a fall. Jake found his first water source within 30 minutes. A crack in a large boulder held a small pool of clear liquid. He tested it by putting a drop on his tongue. It tasted clean and had no smell. Jake drank carefully, taking small sips and waiting to see how his stomach reacted. While he waited, Jake began collecting materials. He needed shelter, tools, and a way to signal for help or escape. The creatures watching him probably expected him to panic and waste energy running around. Instead, he worked methodically, like he was setting up a long-term camp. Sharp rocks became cutting tools. Flat stones became plates and containers. Jake found plants with tough fibers that could be woven into rope. Everything had a purpose, even if that purpose was not immediately obvious. By the time the smaller sun reached its highest point, Jake had established a base camp in a sheltered area between three large rocks. He had collected enough water to last several days and identified at least 5 different plants that might be edible. Jake tested each plant carefully. He rubbed small amounts on his skin and waited for reactions. Then he touched them to his lips, then his tongue, then chewed. Small amounts without swallowing. If a plant passed all these tests, he would try eating a tiny amount and wait several hours. 2 of the plants passed his tests. One had roots that tasted like bitter potatoes. The other had leaves that were sour but nutritious. Jake marked the locations of these plants in his mind and began harvesting them in small amounts. The creatures had not given him any tools, but Jake had brought his own. His tactical knife made cutting and digging much easier. The ferro rod would be crucial. Once the suns went down and the desert got cold, Jake spent the afternoon building a proper shelter. He used flat rocks for walls and found a piece of metal debris to use as a roof. The metal was strange, lighter than aluminum, but stronger than steel. It had alien markings on it, but Jake did not care about that. He cared that it would keep the heat off him during the day and hold warmth at night. As the larger sun began to set, Jake started his first fire. He gathered dry plant material and arranged it in a small pit surrounded by rocks. The ferro rod sent sparks into the tinder, and soon he had flames. The fire served multiple purposes. It would keep him warm when the temperature dropped. It would cook his food and purify water. It would provide light for working after dark. And it would show his captors that he was not just surviving, but thriving. Jake cooked some of the plant. Roots in water heated over the fire. The bitter taste improved when they were boiled. He ate slowly, paying attention to how his body responded. So far, he felt strong and alert. When full darkness came, Jake discovered something interesting. The desert was not actually dark. Strange plants began to glow with soft light, creating an alien landscape of blues and greens. Small flying creatures that looked like jellyfish drifted through the air, pulsing with their own light. Jake added more fuel to his fire and settled down to wait. He had survived the first day, which was longer than his captors expected. Tomorrow he would begin working on escape. But first he needed to understand his prison better. Jake walked to the edge of his camp and threw a small rock as hard as he could. The rock flew about 50 yards and then stopped in mid-air, as if it had hit an invisible wall. A moment later, it fell straight down. So he was in some kind of enclosed space, probably a large room designed to look like a desert. The sky might be artificial, and the horizon was definitely fake. That was useful information. His captors had created an impressive simulation, but it was still a simulation. Jake threw rocks in different directions, mapping the boundaries of his prison. The space was roughly circular and about 200 yards across, big enough to feel like freedom, but small enough to be controlled. He returned to his fire and began working on his next project. Using plant fibers and sharp rocks, Jake started making a bow. It would take several days to complete, but he had time. His captors thought they were studying him, but Jake was studying them right back. The second day brought new challenges. Jake woke to find small creatures had visited his camp during the night. They had not taken anything, but they had left tracks. The tracks were unlike anything Jake had seen before, with too many toes and claw marks that suggested climbing ability. Jake followed the tracks and found the creatures living in burrows under the larger rocks. They were about the size of rabbits, but moved like lizards. They seemed curious about him but not afraid. That suggested they had not evolved around large predators. Jake spent the morning observing the creatures and learning their behavior. They ate the same plants he had identified as safe, which confirmed his food choices. They also led him to another water source, a small spring hidden behind a curtain of glowing vines. By noon, Jake had completed his bow and made several arrows with sharp stone points. He did not plan to hunt the small creatures unless he had to, but having weapons made him feel better. The bow could also be used for fishing if he found any water deep enough to hold fish. Jake used the afternoon to explore the far edges of his prison. He found the metal debris he had used for his roof was part of a larger structure, probably a crashed vehicle of some kind. Most of it was buried in the sand, but Jake was able to dig out several useful pieces. One piece looked like a control panel with symbols that reminded him of the writing on the ship. Jake could not read the symbols, but he noticed some of them were still glowing faintly. This suggested the device still had power. Jake carefully removed the panel from the wreckage and carried it back to his camp. He had no idea what it did, but it was clearly advanced technology. If he could figure out how it worked, it might be useful for escape. The third day brought visitors. Jake was working on the alien device when he noticed movement near the invisible wall. 3 of the tall creatures were standing just outside his prison watching him. One of them was Commander Vex. Jake ignored them and continued working. He had learned that the device responded to touch, and different symbols produced different effects. One symbol made the panel warm, another made it vibrate, a third made it emit a high-pitched sound. Impressive adaptation, Commander Vex's voice came from speakers hidden around the desert. You have exceeded our projections by a significant margin. Jake did not look up from the device. He had found a sequence of symbols that made the panel flash in a regular pattern. It reminded him of Morse code, though the timing was different. Most humans become distressed when separated from their technology, Vex continued. You have created your own technology from available resources. This behavior was not predicted by our models. Jake finally looked up at his captors. Your models are wrong about a lot of things. Perhaps, Vex admitted. We will need to adjust our testing parameters. You will be moved to a more challenging environment. Jake smiled. Looking forward to it. That night, Jake made a breakthrough with the alien device. By pressing symbols in the right sequence, he managed to activate what looked like a communication system. Text scrolled across a small screen, written in the same alien symbols he had seen throughout the ship. Jake could not read the text, but he could see patterns. Some symbols appeared more often than others. Some sequences repeated regularly. It looked like status reports or system diagnostics. More importantly, Jake found a way to access what looked like a map. The display showed a three-dimensional diagram of the ship, with his location marked as a small dot. He could see corridors, rooms, and what might be other prison cells. Jake memorized as much of the map as he could before the device's power ran out. When the screen went dark, he carefully buried the panel in the sand near his shelter. His captors might not realize he had found it, and they definitely did not know he had learned to use it. On the fourth day, the desert began to change. The temperature dropped and strange storms swept across the landscape. Jake's shelter protected him from the worst of it, but he could see his captors were trying to make things harder for him. Jake adapted. He improved his shelter, found new water sources, and discovered that some of the glowing plants could be used as fuel for his fire. Every challenge his captors threw at him only made him stronger and more resourceful. By the fifth day, Jake had a comfortable camp with reliable food, water, and shelter. He had weapons, tools, and a basic understanding of alien technology. He had mapped his prison and identified possible escape routes. Most importantly, he had learned that his captors were not as smart as they thought they were. They understood human biology and psychology. Jake woke up in a new environment. This time he was in what looked like a jungle, but the plants were wrong. The trees had silver bark and leaves that moved without any wind. The air was thick and humid, filled with strange scents that made his nose burn. Above him, through the canopy of alien trees, Jake could see the same artificial sky. But now it was a sickly green color with 3 small moons that moved too fast across it. His prison had changed, but it was still a prison. Jake stood up and checked his equipment. His knife and ferro rod were still in his pocket, along with small pieces of the alien device he had managed to hide in his clothes. He had also kept some of the plant fibers he had woven into rope. The ground under his feet was soft and wet, covered with rotting leaves that squelched with each step. Jake could hear water moving somewhere nearby, and the sounds of creatures moving through the trees. This environment was more dangerous than the desert, but it also offered more resources. Jake found a stream within a few minutes of walking. The water was clear but had a strange blue tint. He tested it the same way he had tested the water in the desert, taking small amounts and waiting to see how his body reacted. It seemed safe, though it had a metallic taste. While he waited to see if the water would make him sick, Jake began exploring his new prison. The jungle was thick with vegetation, making it hard to see more than a few yards in any direction. But Jake had learned to move quietly through dense terrain during his military training. He found his first sign of animal life when something large crashed through the bushes ahead of him. Jake froze and listened. Whatever it was sounded big and moved fast. He would need to be careful until he understood what kind of predators lived in this artificial jungle. Jake climbed a tree to get a better view of his surroundings. The silver bark was slippery, but the trunk had natural handholds where branches had broken off. From 30 feet up, Jake could see over most of the canopy. His prison was smaller than the desert had been, maybe 100 yards across. But it was much more complex, with multiple levels of vegetation and what looked like caves or burrows in the rocky areas. There were also structures that might have been ruins, though they were too overgrown to see clearly. Jake climbed down and began setting up a base camp. He found a spot where several large trees grew close together, creating natural walls. A small stream ran nearby, providing fresh water. The canopy was thick enough to provide shelter from rain, but open enough to let in light. Jake's first priority was security. The jungle clearly had dangerous animals, and he needed protection while he slept. He used his knife to cut branches and his rope to lash them together, creating a platform about 10 feet off the ground. It would not stop a determined predator, but it would give him warning and time to react. By the time the 3 moons reached their highest point, Jake had completed his shelter and started a small fire. The alien wood burned with strange colors, mostly blue and green flames that gave off plenty of heat but little smoke. Jake was cooking some edible roots he had found when he heard the first attack on his camp. Something large and heavy crashed into the base of his tree, shaking the entire platform. Jake grabbed his bow and looked down to see what looked like a cross between a bear and a lizard trying to climb toward him. The creature was about 6 feet long with powerful claws and teeth, like daggers. Its skin was covered in scales that shifted color to match the surroundings. Jake could only see it clearly when it moved. Jake nocked an arrow and aimed carefully. He did not want to kill the creature unless he had to, but he needed to show it that he was not easy prey. His arrow hit the creature in the shoulder, causing it to roar and fall back to the ground. The creature looked up at Jake with intelligent eyes, as if trying to decide whether he was worth the effort. After a moment, it turned and disappeared into the jungle. Jake had passed some kind of test. Over the next few hours, Jake was visited by several more creatures. Most of them were curious rather than aggressive. They seemed to be testing him, trying to figure out what kind of animal he was. Jake remained alert, but did not attack unless threatened. That night, Jake made an important discovery. When the artificial suns went down, the jungle came alive with bioluminescent plants and animals. The same way the desert had glowed, the jungle pulsed with different colors of light. But more importantly, Jake could see patterns in the lights. Some of the glowing plants flashed in regular sequences, like the alien device had done. Jake realized he was looking at some kind of communication network. The plants were talking to each other, sharing information about temperature, moisture, and the presence of animals. Jake spent hours watching the light patterns and began to understand the basic signals. A rapid blue flash seemed to mean danger. A slow green pulse indicated all was well. Red lights appeared when large animals moved through the area. By learning this plant language, Jake could track the movements of predators and avoid dangerous areas. He could also use the network to his advantage, creating false signals to confuse animals or his captors. The second day in the jungle brought new challenges. Jake woke to find his camp surrounded by small creatures that looked like monkeys with too many arms. They were not threatening, but they were curious about everything Jake owned. They examined his bow, tried to steal his rope, and chattered at him in high-pitched voices. Jake watched them carefully and began to understand their behavior. They were tool users, but their tools were simple. They used sticks to dig for insects and rocks to crack open nuts. When they saw Jake's more advanced tools, they became excited and tried to trade with him. Jake realized these creatures might be useful allies. He began offering them small gifts, like pieces of rope and smooth stones. In return, they showed him where to find the best food and water sources. They also warned him about dangerous areas by chattering and pointing. With the help of his new friends, Jake quickly mapped the jungle and identified all the major threats. There were 3 large predators that hunted in different areas. There were poisonous plants that could kill with a touch. And there were areas where the ground was unstable and could collapse without warning. But Jake also found opportunities. Hidden in the ruins was more alien technology, including what looked like a power source that still functioned. Some of the plants produced materials that were stronger than anything found on Earth, and the stream contained minerals that could be used to make better tools. On the 3rd day, Jake made contact with his captors again. Commander Vex appeared outside the invisible walls, along with several other creatures who took notes on glowing tablets. "Your adaptation continues to exceed our projections," Vex announced through the hidden speakers. "Most subjects do not survive. Contact with the apex predators." Jake was working on a new project, using alien materials to build a device he hoped would disrupt his prison walls. He did not look up when Vex spoke. "We have observed your interaction with the local wildlife," Vex continued. "Your ability to form cooperative relationships was not predicted by our models. This suggests human social behavior is more complex than we assumed." Jake finally looked at his captors. "You assume a lot of things. Most of them are wrong." "Perhaps," Vex admitted, "but we are learning. Each test provides valuable data about human capabilities and limitations." "What happens when your tests are over?" Jake asked. Vex was quiet for a moment. "That depends on the results. Useful subjects may be retained for further study. Others will be processed." Jake did not ask what processed meant. He could guess. These creatures saw humans as lab animals, useful only as long as they provided interesting data. When the experiments were done, the animals would be disposed of. That night, Jake completed his new device by combining alien technology with materials. From the jungle, he had created something that might be able to disrupt the energy fields holding him prisoner. It was based on the communication system he had observed in the glowing plants, but modified to work on different frequencies. Jake tested the device carefully, making small adjustments until he found the right signal pattern. When he activated it, the air around the invisible walls began to shimmer. For just a moment, Jake could see the actual barriers that contained him. They looked like sheets of flowing energy, beautiful but deadly. The device worked, but only for a few seconds before it overloaded and died. Jake had proven that the walls could be disrupted, but he would need a much more powerful device to create a hole big enough to escape through. Jake hid the remains of his device and began planning his next move. He had learned important things about his captors and their technology. They were advanced, but they were not invincible. Their energy systems could be disrupted. Their monitoring systems had blind spots, and most importantly, they did not understand human ingenuity. On the 4th day, Jake began gathering materials for a bigger project. He needed to build something that could not only disrupt the walls, but also get him out of this prison and into the ship proper. He had studied the map from the alien device and knew where he needed to go. But first, he had to survive whatever new test his captors had planned. Jake could see them watching him more closely now. taking more measurements and making more notes. They were preparing something special, probably something they thought would finally break him. Jake smiled as he worked. Let them try. Every challenge Jake's escape came sooner than expected. On the morning of the 5th day, he woke to find the jungle in chaos. The bioluminescent. Plants were flashing red warning signals, and all the animals had gone silent. Something was very wrong. Jake climbed to his observation platform and looked around. Through the artificial canopy, he could see lights moving on the ship beyond his prison. Alarms were sounding, though the noise was muffled by the energy barriers. His captors were dealing with some kind of emergency. This was the opportunity Jake had been waiting for. He grabbed his improvised tools and the pieces of alien technology he had collected, then climbed down from his shelter. If the ship was in crisis, the power to his prison might be reduced or diverted. Jake made his way to the spot where his first device had briefly disrupted the walls. He pulled out a new device he had been working on, one that used the jungle's own bioluminescent network to amplify its signal. He had spent days studying the plant communication system and learning how to tap into it. Jake activated the device and watched as the energy walls began to flicker. The disruption was stronger this time, lasting almost a full minute before the device burned out. But it was long enough for Jake to see something important. There was a maintenance panel hidden behind the energy barrier. Jake used his knife to dig into the jungle floor, following power cables he could now see running beneath the artificial soil. The cables led to a junction box buried under a pile of alien debris. Jake had found the control system for his prison. The junction box was locked, but Jake's knife made short work of the alien metal. Inside, he found a complex array of circuits and power conduits. Jake did not understand the technology, but he understood the principles. Every system had weak points, and every weakness could be exploited. Jake began systematically disconnecting circuits and rerouting power flows. He worked carefully, testing each change to see what happened. Some circuits controlled the temperature and atmosphere. Others maintained the artificial gravity, but the one Jake was looking for controlled the energy barriers. When Jake found the right circuit, he did not disconnect it immediately. Instead, he rigged it with a timer made from materials in the jungle. The timer would give him 15 minutes to get ready before the barriers failed completely. Jake returned to his shelter and gathered his essential equipment. His knife and ferro rod went in his pockets. His bow and arrows went across his back. The pieces of alien technology were wrapped in plant fibers and tied to his belt. He was as ready as he would ever be. The timer reached 0 and the jungle went dark. All the bioluminescent plants stopped glowing at once as the power to Jake's prison was cut. The energy barriers flickered and died, leaving only empty air between Jake and freedom. Jake ran toward the barrier but stopped at the edge of his former prison. Beyond the invisible walls, he could see the actual structure of the ship for the first time. He was in a large chamber with curved walls and a high ceiling. Other chambers were visible through transparent barriers, each containing different environments for testing. Jake could see other prisoners in some of the chambers. Most looked human, though they were too far away to be sure. In one chamber, a woman was huddled in a corner while alien creatures took measurements. In another, a man was trying to build shelter from rocks and metal scraps. Jake wanted to free the other prisoners, but he could not help them if he was recaptured. He needed to find a way off this ship and get word to Earth about the invasion. The other humans would have to wait. Jake moved carefully through the ship's corridors, staying in the shadows and avoiding the main pathways. The alien alarms were still sounding, and he could see crew members running back and forth with glowing tablets and strange tools. Something had definitely gone wrong with their ship. Jake followed the map he had memorized from the alien device, making his way toward what he hoped were the ship's vital systems. If he could access their communication equipment, he might be able to send a message to Earth. If he could reach their navigation systems, he might be able to change their course or send them off into empty space. The corridors were designed for creatures taller than humans with high ceilings and wide passages, but they also had maintenance tunnels that were just the right size for someone Jake's height. Jake used these tunnels to move through the ship without being seen. From inside the walls, Jake could hear the aliens talking through their translation devices. Most of the conversation was technical, dealing with whatever emergency was happening. But Jake caught fragments that told him important information. The ship's main power systems were failing. Something had gone wrong with their energy collectors, and backup systems were struggling to keep critical functions online. That explained why Jake's prison had lost power. The aliens were shutting down non-essential systems to keep the ship running. Jake also learned that they were not alone. The aliens kept mentioning other ships in their fleet, including something called the Advance Force. Jake realized this was just one ship in a much larger invasion group. Even if he stopped this ship, others would continue toward Earth. Jake found his first target in the ship's communication center. The room was filled with glowing displays and complex control panels. Two aliens were working frantically to maintain contact with their fleet while dealing with power fluctuations. Jake waited until both aliens left the room, then slipped inside. The control panels were covered with symbols he could not read, but Jake had learned to recognize certain patterns. He found what looked like a communication channel and began experimenting with the controls. Jake managed to access what appeared to be the ship's outgoing message system. He could not read the alien language, but he could send his own signal on the same frequency. Jake pulled out his ferro rod and began tapping out messages in Morse code. The signal would be weak and might not reach Earth, but it was better than nothing. Jake sent the same message over and over. Invasion fleet approaching Earth. Alien ships from Zephyr system. Prepare defenses. This is Jake Morrison, U.S. Marine. Jake had no idea if anyone on Earth would receive his message or understand what it meant, but he had to try. Earth needed to know what was coming. After sending his warning, Jake moved on to his next target, the ship's navigation system. If he could not stop the invasion fleet, maybe he could at least delay it or send it off course. The navigation center was more heavily guarded than the communication room. Jake counted 4 aliens working at different stations, with 2 more standing watch. He would not be able to sneak in and sabotage the systems without being detected. Jake decided on a different approach. He made his way to the ship's power distribution center, a room filled with massive energy conduits and control systems. If he could disrupt the power flow to navigation, the ship would be unable to maintain its course. The power center was unguarded but filled with dangerous energy fields. Jake could feel the electricity in the air, making his hair stand on end. He worked carefully, studying the power flow patterns and identifying the most critical systems. Jake found the main power conduit that fed the navigation systems. It was heavily shielded and protected, but Jake had learned a few things about alien technology during his imprisonment. He used pieces of the alien device he had salvaged to create a feedback loop in the power system. The feedback loop would build up over time, eventually causing a cascade failure that would shut down navigation and several other critical systems. By the time the aliens figured out what had happened and how to fix it, Jake would be long gone. Jake's next stop was the ship's database. If he could access their files, he might learn more about the invasion plans and find weaknesses in there. Technology. The database was located in a heavily secured area, but Jake had become expert at moving through the ship's maintenance systems. Jake found a way into the database center through an air recycling duct. The room was filled with glowing columns that pulsed with information. Jake could not read the data, but he could copy it onto a storage device he had built from salvaged alien components. While the data was copying, Jake searched the room for anything else that might be useful. He found what looked like a portable communication device and several data storage units. Jake pocketed everything he could carry. The copy finished just as Jake heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He quickly made his way back into the air ducts and began moving toward his final target, the ship's main computer core. If Jake could access the central computer, he might be able to plant a virus or logical bomb that would cripple the ship's ability to function. He had learned enough about their systems to know where to look for vulnerabilities. The computer core was the most heavily protected area on the ship, surrounded by multiple layers of security and energy barriers. But Jake had noticed something during his exploration. The maintenance ducts connected to the core's cooling system. If he could reach the cooling system, he could access the core itself. Jake made his way through increasingly narrow ducts until he reached the cooling system. The machinery was alien, but followed familiar principles. Coolant flowed through pipes and heat exchangers, keeping the computer systems from overheating. Jake found an access port in the CIE